Hello, everyone. Welcome to Voices and Views. This is Mark Matheson. My guest is Craig Downer. He is an advocate for wild horses and burros. He's the author of The Wild Horse Conspiracy and is involved in many projects to save the wild horses. So welcome, Craig.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
All right. Now, we talked last year a little bit about your book, but you now have an updated version. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Wild Horse Conspiracy has been updated throughout the work, and it has new sources and describes new legislation and generally how the movement has progressed. I've been back to Washington. I delivered a petition there to stop the excessive roundups and met with congressmen and senators and officials in the Wild Horse and Burro program. So, yeah, lots happened, and I think the movement is stronger now. There's been additional films, and it's getting more organized, and we're getting a lot of support from many segments of our society. I'm really excited for some breakthroughs here coming up.
All right, so last week or a week and a half ago, you presented that to Interior Secretary Sally Jewell.
Yeah, actually, that was back in end of January, very last day of January, and right then, that very day before, my scientific article was published too, peer-reviewed. The horse and burro is positively contributing return natives in North America, was published in the American Journal of Life Sciences.
All right.
So it's getting a lot of feedback and readership. So I'm quite encouraged.
I'd like to talk a little bit about that. For people that are not familiar, we've all been taught that the wild horses in America were from Coronado's, the horses he lost. So the horses are a reintroduced species. But you have a whole different theory, and you have evidence to back this up. So talk about the origin of horses, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the horse family, genus and species, originated here in North America. The fossil evidence is just abundant, but it's commonly thought that around, anywhere from 7 to 10,000 years ago, they died out. However, what I found is there's much evidence that there were horses here at various times since then, whether it's around 6,000, 5, 4, 3, 2, all the way to shortly before the arrival of Columbus in America. It seems pretty well substantiated, and the reason I call the title of my book "The Wild Horse Conspiracy" is that this evidence will often be conveniently lost or expunged from the record. There just seems to be certain elements. I'm not saying that certainly not all the paleontological workers are that way, but there seems to be certain elements that are just trying to discredit the place of the horse in America. So I made a point of amassing that and constructed a chart, and myself have found a petroglyph down south of where I live, a few hours out in the desert near the White Mountains and near the Whitney area.
And that's Nevada.
The highest mountain in the lower 48. And
this is
it
Nevada?
Appears to be at least 1,000 years, between 1,000 and 3,000. And there are geoglyphs, and both of those are pictured in my book. And by the way, you can get my book on Amazon in the updated version, and it seems to be sparking a lot of interest now. I was just at the Western States Horse Expo in Sacramento and had really good reception there from from all kinds of people, from ranchers just to regular horse riders, or young and old. So I was quite encouraged. And you can get it on Amazon. Just type in the title and my name, Craig C. Downer.
All right. Now, I've read the book, and I thought it was excellent. However, you do have to get it on Amazon here, because the local bookstores, I have not seen it unless I didn't find the right section. The library does not carry it, so...
Yeah, I'd like to try and get it in there, so if they want to contact me, I can arrange to supply the books, or they can always, go directly just to the publisher and order them to at a special rate. But if you go on my new website, thewildhorseconspiracy.org, I have a lot of those links, and it's also been reconverted as an ebook.
All right.
So people can see the pictures and color, and if they have the Kindle Fire, and a lot of people prefer that these days. It is pretty magical to see that on the screen.
Yeah.
Sort of three-dimensional.
Now, the Wild Horse Act has been in effect since 1971. That's over 40 years ago. But yet, it's not really accomplishing what it, protect the wild horses and burros, has it? Tell us some of the problems.
No, it's really upsetting to see the percentages. For example, Montana, your state, I mean, it didn't have too many acres to begin with, but nonetheless, it's the percentage-wise, it's zeroed out most percentage of acreage that were originally mandated for the wild horses. That's 87%, and I have a chart there in my book explaining that. But there are other states like Wyoming, which is just zeroed out, several million, and same with Nevada and California. They've zeroed out several million legal acres for the wild horses and burros. So, just bringing a lot of these key aspects out so that people can look at them and say, well, these are still legal areas, and they should be restored. I mean, after all, the Multiple Use Act is about multiple use on all the public lands, and it's about countering the monopoly of just certain interests. So we need to restore these, and as I point out, the equids, the horses and burros, play a really important niche here. They fill a really important role. They're not a ruminant digester, but they're a post-gastric or a cecal digester, and that's a major point. It means that they can really complement the ruminants, and they can complement the ecosystem. They don't as thoroughly degrade what they eat, and consequently their droppings still have a lot of substance to them. And you can see that the little insects go like the dung beetles, and they disperse the dung throughout the soils. I've observed that quite closely, and the microorganisms, birds come to and peck at them, but just in general, they contribute a lot more to the humus content, which is any organic farmer knows, or gardener, is very vital to the health of soils. Also, many more seeds are left intact and can germinate. So I just, in general, I speak up for the horses and their place in nature. They're truly one of the most ancient and long-standing presences here in North America, especially, and throughout many other areas of the world.
Right. Now, not too long ago, I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with the Clive Bundy dispute on BML land. And there was a great article in Forbes not long ago. Federal grazing program in Bundy dispute rips off taxpayers and wild horses.
Yeah, I read that. I was cited there and with links to my article by Vickery Eckhoff. Yes, I thought she got right to the crux of the matter. Just in general, that family, the Bundy family, has been defying the federal government for over 20 years, not paying their fees. And I know down in his area there in southeast Nevada, they've pretty much zeroed out all the wild horse and burros. And I was wondering why they did that. I think a lot of it was because of his threats, the threats of this extreme individual and these type of people that they don't respect the federal authority at all. I mean, they're being very bold in their claims, and I found it irksome that the federal government will treat a wild horse advocate like he's some terrible eco-terrorist. Say, if they're out there rounding him up, which is very brutal in itself. I've observed enough of them, helicopter roundups, and yet they will back down to an individual or to a family group, a clan, basically, such as the Bundy clan and his supporters. So I'm just hoping that this will wake a lot of people up, and I'm glad that researcher and writer Vickery Eckhoff had the courage to expose this, to expose what's wrong, and that's the first step toward rectifying what's wrong. And I'm encouraged about the let's see, I looked it up in my book to get it correct. It's the Safeguard American Food Export Bill, commonly known as SAFE, and that's Senate Bill 541, House of Representatives 1094. I think it has a good chance of passing. It has quite a few sponsors in both the House and Senate, and it would stop a lot of this massive transport of the horses, including many of the formerly wild and free roaming horses, both to Mexico and Canada, where they are slaughtered in often very cruel and painful circumstances, and require people to really be responsible, including our own federal government. And as you know, from last year, I have a proposal which I gave to them in Washington. I discussed with the officials, and more people are recognizing that it has merit. It's called reserve design, and it can be done, and that's my goal now, is to get enough support to really follow through as a professional wildlife ecologist with this reserve design. And in my article, I list 23 areas throughout the western United States where I believe it can and should work, but I'd like to go to each of these areas and really scout out the herd, meet the communities, gather information and observation on the ecosystem and its unique qualities, and then see where it can work and get going. Often this incorporates natural barriers or semi-permeable barriers, but if we follow through and do it right, create buffer zones, public cooperation, win-win situations where they can monitor, have eco tours, we could we could realize these reserves as, to a very large degree, as naturally self-stabilizing populations of the wild horses and burros, and that would obviate the so-called need for these tragic roundups and placing them in the long-term or short-term holding. They're supposed to be well in excess now of 50,000, mainly wild horses and some burros, minor percentage, in these holding facilities, and it's pretty much just in the dark. The public doesn't know, so there's a lot of rumors that many of them are dying or even being surreptitiously taken off, clandestinely taken off and shipped to Mexico. And there's certain organizations like Animals Angels it's documented this, and it's very, very alarming. So just looking at the long-term view, something has to be done. And I was talking there to congressmen such as Grijalva and Israel and others about reviving a bill that almost passed a few years ago, the Roam or Restore American Mustang bill. Passed the House, but was let to die in the Senate. I think it could be even made better, and this time we could get it passed and get a real reform going here and get a restoration of the herds to much more truly viable levels, and to get this reserve design written into it so they have some real sound directives. So that's where I'm headed now as far as what needs to be happened. I don't think there's I don't think there's as many wild horses and burros. I'm almost certain there isn't out on the public lands today as there were at the passage of the act. I think there's fewer, actually.
Yeah,
around 30,000. And what we noticed recently is they're not taking into, when they make these blanket statements about doubling every 4 years, they're not taking into account the natural mortality factors or unnatural, because there's a lot of illegal killings too that go on, or capturings, and they're just sort of fudging it all to make it look like there's a big explosion. And the recent report by the National Academy of Sciences that came out exactly a year ago this month did advise that taking these populations way down, like as they do, disrupts the social stability, the natural social units or bands, and the interrelationships between the bands within a herd, and that causes kind of a free-for-all. So those few individuals that remain have their families broken up. They're bewildered, and they reproduce younger at ages that they wouldn't normally, and so they're desperate and they're trying to survive. So even such a conservative group as that committee there at the National Academy of Science agreed that these drastic reductions are not the way to go. And I did give them the reserve design proposal, discussed it with them, and they received copies of my book. So I'm hopeful. I think the secret to getting reform is persistence and not flagging, not giving up. And I don't intend to, and I'm encouraged about all the people that have joined with me. And I'm a member of the board of the Cloud Foundation, and they have just, along with Friends of Animals, they're in New York, I guess, have filed a suit that these populations of wild horse and burro should be considered as endangered and I agree with him. These are unique populations, and if you look at the burro, it's actually the same species as the African wild ass. And in my book, I explain why actually that's kind of a misnomer. The African wild ass is of North American origin, and I cite the source, Dr. Hans Klingel, and other paleontologists. The fossil record is here, and it is there in Africa. It's dying out. I mean, it's in critical danger of extinction. So you would think that they would recognize that the wild burros are returning to their ancestral land and are the best hope for this species, especially when you consider that the true vigor or survivability of a species or a subspecies or whatever units you want to make is when the animals are allowed to be in the wild. Then they retain their ability to survive in the long term, and same can be said about the horse.
Well, it seems to me that a lot of people who should be on the side of the horses, it's almost like the foxes guarding the hen house. The people involved with the Bureau of Land Management, they're, for example, Boyd Spratling, he was past president of the Nevada Cattlemen's Association. He's a horse opponent, and yet he is on the Bureau of Land Management National Wild Horse Advisory Board. I can only imagine what he's advising.
Well, exactly. Yeah, he comes across as being thoughtful and well studied, but when you look at his actions, he doesn't. He seems to his whole career and everything have conditioned him to view the horses as just domestic animals and to relate them to people, mainly ranchers, and how they fit in with the ranching lifestyle. So, I was nominated to the board this last time, as was Ginger Catherine. So we were just totally passed by. Well, we truly value the horses in their natural state and admire their spirit, and we can see the positive side. But there are a lot of people, and before Spratling, there was a guy named Larry Johnson, who was a legal Indian, but he largely just represented the hunter interest, and he would constantly attack or plot to exaggerate the effects of the horses, or to create a hysterical mood as though they were all totally out of control. And I attended those meetings and testified along with a lot of other wild horse and burro advocates, and we just felt very, very discriminated and as though they had their minds made up. But there are a few now that are speaking out more that there needs to be some reform. And I was at the recent Sacramento meeting in March and was able to testify there. And there's a Tim Harvey from Vermont, I believe. He spoke out that all is not as some certain segments of our society portray on the wild horse issue, and that these appropriate management levels are really seriously low and need to be examined. They're not genetically viable, and they don't represent allowing the horses or the burros to fill their niche in these areas. So I'm not giving up. No, I have the courage of my convictions, and I'm pleased that other people are, can see that we need a much more natural approach to these animals, and I think this reserve design is really the answer. It might entail some more effort, but I mean the satisfaction from seeing reserve design work would just totally outweigh the efforts that are required, and so much that what is required is just being positive. And if we can get our government officials to take their duty seriously and stand up in a positive way for the horses, form cooperative agreements under Section 4 and 6 of the Act. In my book, I list 19 points of law, by the way, right up front, that should be working for the horses, including these cooperative agreements. So actually we can go in and identify complete habitats for long-term viable populations. And so I'm just following through on this, looking forward to getting out to some of these areas. So maybe you'll see me up there pretty soon.
I hope so. One of the problems I see is there's a lot of misinformation, and it's, I guess it comes down to an economic viewpoint. And, for example, I saw an article last fall in the Missoulian newspaper about some wild horses on the other side of the mountain range here, and it was definitely anti-wild horse. And so that's where I see a problem, is the misinformation and the need to get out good information. Unfortunately, when you look on the internet, do a search on wild horses, you find just as many articles against them as there are for them. But thankfully, there's a lot of excellent websites and articles that...
Right. Yeah, no, I think people are realizing that this is a general public interest rather than a vested exploitative interest in the public lands, and that in the past the people who actually for whom the act was passed are being short-changed here, and actually the people against whom, or the interests against whom the law was passed to defend the wild horses, are being allowed to call the shots, and that just represents an abrogation of duty or responsibility on the part of the BLM and the Forest Service, the two agencies. So the good news is that the law is still the law, and we just have to reform and get the officials to really stand up and show some courage and restore the horses. For example, there in your state of Montana, and I visited the Pryor Mountains. That's the only area that still has any of the original 7 areas. Well, six of the 7 areas have been, the populations have been totally eliminated, but they could be restored. So one area I note there in that map that has the 23 areas to start with is up there over in the western part. And by the way, you should be able to link to my article just by going on the wildhorseconspiracy.org and going under sources.
Mm-hmm.
And then that journal article should come right up and be linkable.
All right, thank you. Now, that article we talked about earlier on, Advocates Want Endangered Status for the Wild Horses, came across a Montana tie-in here. Jay Kilpatrick of the Science and Conservation Center down in Billings. Could you talk to us a little bit about this place and the man?
Oh yes, he wrote Into the Wind, a book about the wild horses, and He's basically a physiologist, veterinarian who studied the wild horse and observed them, and he's looked a lot into their evolution too, and he supports their being recognized as truly natives here in North America, and he cites the different articles such as that of the Finnish geneticist Dr. Anne Forsten, who that proved that actually even the modern horse species, Equus caballus, originated, all the evidence indicates, originated in North America around 2 million years ago at least.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, he's been pretty good, but he's a big advocate of the reproductive inhibitor PZP, or porcine zona pellucida, which is derived from hogs, I guess, and it goes in and coats the ovum, the ova, the eggs of the mares, so that the sperm cannot penetrate it. I think there's a bit too much evidence. I could see perhaps in very desperate situations having to use this, but I much prefer a natural approach, reserve design, and not rather than the law says minimum feasible interference with these animals. The sections are listed in my 19 points of law. Well, this doesn't sound like minimum feasible interference. It sounds like, they're pretty much domesticating the animals. And what's going to happen when they're all stressed out and are trying to reproduce and form bands and they're frustrated? That's going to cause a lot of stress and disrupt the natural harems and the social order. They'll become, the mares will become frustrated and they'll try and mate with another stallion. So they don't think they've totally thought this through, and various observers have indicated this does happen. Another thing is when it wears off, the mares can give birth late in the season or in the middle of the winter, and their young can die, or they themselves can die, and that's been observed as well. So although it seems like a panacea, I don't think it's the real panacea that reserve design is. And I think reserve design is it's not the quick drug fix. It's the right thing to do. It's being responsible and allowing the horses to fill their place in sufficiently large area and suitable habitat so that they are truly viable and able to adapt over the generations in a harmonious way, and not be continually jerked around or overly reduced and frustrated in their attempts to harmonize with the life community. I describe that in considerable detail in my book, especially in Chapter 4. So I urge people to get a copy of my book, and they can contact me, ccdowner@aol.com, or they can phone me at 775-901-2094, or they can just type in the title. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and in other sources too.
Now, you've also got a musical CD out. Tell us a little about that.
All right, yeah, I did well there in Sacramento. A lot of people went for the CD. It's called Wild Horse Rhapsody, and it's on the piano. And these are my original melodies. I play the piano. But I worked with a professional pianist, Joanne Grauer, who used to be the accompanist of Andy Williams. And we composed, we put together an arrangement of 13 medleys, and then each medley suggests a different aspect of the wild horses, its life in nature, and I think it turned out very well. That's one thing I'm thankful for, is I have a musical gift in that melodies do occur to me, and I record them. I'm not the pianist that my mother was. She had a naturally gift to play, but I can play fairly well if I give them a little practice. So I can play some of these melodies.
Good. Is there a place on your website or on YouTube or whatever to sample your music?
Tom Porter incorporated some of my melodies in some of his websites. I think he just has my name, Craig Downer The Wild Horse Conspiracy or Wild Horses, and there you can see in the back, or here in the background, are some of my melodies.
Okay, so
some of them have a real Western flavor, like you'd be familiar with. They might seem maybe like going back into the 1800s or so, but maybe something about my background here, being from pioneer stock and deeply rooted here in the United States.
All right. Now, I want to bring this to a local level. I mean, we're here in Great Falls. There are no wild horse herds for a long, long ways from here. This is cattle country. There might be some opposition, but what does this mean to us? Why should people here in the middle of Montana care? What would you tell them?
Well, I would say that it's because of the many positive contributions that the wild horses make, and not least of which is their great beauty. It's thrilling to see a horse just naturally let go and reverted to the wild. They come alive in so many ways that you don't observe with a domesticated horse. I think that number one is they could be a great aesthetic resource, and they're so called in the original debates concerning the act was that it was pretty universally recognized their great beauty, especially in the wild. That's one thing, and another is their great ecological contribution. They increase the diversity, they themselves as a species, and also how they help enrich the soils and seed many more plants. And so truly a wild horse containing ecosystem is a very positive thing, and it's an enhanced ecosystem. So I think if they just have to give it a chance, and something that is very unwholesome is when you just have one or a few interests, such as the ranchers dominating the society, and the other ones that are more aesthetic or more naturalistic in their approach to life are kind of drowned out. Well, that's not a very wholesome situation. And I know recently there's been controversy over the wolves, and a lot of the wolves that have been making a comeback, the gray wolf, were killed in various states. They're a natural predator of the horses too, so they're like part of the reserve design. And but that's not all there is to self-stabilization of a climax species such as the horse. Actually, when they fill their niche in an area, they intrinsically they start reducing their reproduction and spacing themselves out, and that's why they're called climax species. I just think it would be a great thing for Montana to restore those herds, at least, and get them wherever they're needed. Another thing is they're great reducers of the dry vegetation, dry flammable vegetation. They can be wonderful preventers of catastrophic forest fires or range fires, and that's been proven in so many places. Right, for example, I have a little section about Story County here, which is the cradle of the wild horse movement over here in Virginia City. And there they clearly recognize how very important, and they're still up there, that largely private land in the community. Since the 1800s, they've very strongly recognized that the wild horses prevent the major fires by reducing that dry, flammable grass and some of the bushes there too. That's another thing to think about.
For our listeners, remind everyone that Craig is from Nevada, and Virginia City that he's referring to is Nevada, not Montana. So
there's a Virginia City in Montana?
Yeah, one of the very early mining cities, just like yours.
Oh, neat. I'll have to come there sometime. Yeah, it's been a favorite place of mine. My Danish grandfather used to frequent Virginia City and was himself a horse trainer.
Mm-hmm. Well, the horses, that whole idea about their ecological niche and how they can be a positive contribution to the land they live on is fascinating. And
yeah, I really think so. And I cite the sources. By the way, I've increased the references. There's some real dynamite new references I placed in the book. So those who have got it, I think they'd appreciate having the new version. And I cite some more works that have, for example, by Dr. Zymov there in Siberia in that Pleistocene Park. There's some additional publications there showing how important the horses are to the tundra grassland and seeding it and maintaining it and sort of staving off the potentially very alarming effects of the melting of the permafrost there in northern latitudes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do have some changes. For some areas it's wetter, for some it's drier, but change is inevitable.
Right.
Now,
how many people in Great Falls?
There's rough numbers, about 55 to 60,000.
Fair City. I remember years ago I was taking a course at Lake Itasca in lake ecology or limnology and fern taxonomy and ecology there at through I think it was the University of Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
But on the way back, I stopped in Great Falls and I went on into the park, Glacier National Park, and I stayed in that big long lodge, the old lodge or wooden lodge, in a dormitory. And then the following morning, I got up bright and early and took a hike out into the mountain. And after a couple hours hiking way in there, this was in August, there was a lot of berries, but I looked down and I saw what looked like a burrow coming up at me, but it turned out to be a grizzly, I'd say just subprime, subadult, coming right at me. So my heart started beating and I stood very still. And just while he was watching me and I was watching him, and he stopped about 100 feet away. I thought he was going to grab me or something, but I owe that to the berries. There were some luscious berries there, and so he started devouring those berries. But he'd look up every once in a while and say, stay where you are. I'll get around to you. And then eventually put his snout into an old rotten log, and that's when I decided that I better take the opportunity. I just slowly backed down the hill and out of sight.
You went through the Blackfoot Reservation to get up to where you were there. And from what I've heard, there's some individuals there that have been working hard to get more wild horses, Mustangs, onto the reservation. I apologize, I haven't heard, don't have the details, but I think there's some people up there that are really working on getting...
well, that's really good to hear. Yeah, I did go through that reservation.
Yeah. So I know there's people around that are interested, but you know, there's ranchers that have a lot of land. They can only support so many cattle. But you know, if they just gave the wild horses a try, they wouldn't be competing with their cattle at all, and they could make a positive contribution.
We could prove it to them. Maybe some of those people I just met. There was a young, well, I'd say younger middle-age cowboy that came up and immediately bought my book. He came up with his wife, and he said he'd worked all his life on various ranches in Northern California and parts of Nevada, but he felt they were being very unfairly treated and would like to see them get their just land and resources. And so often the case is, you know, that they will say okay, we're going to have this herd management area. Well, it's reduced from the original 1971, but yeah, here we're going to recognize them. But then they'll proceed, to give 90% or so of the forage to the livestock and just treat the wild horses or burro just like second-class citizens. That's not the law. The law says land principally devoted for the wild horse and burros, not marginalized. So that's what we have to insist on, is a comeback. And I was really, really encouraged to see that, there are ranchers that do value the wild horses.
Yeah. Now you've got a pretty nice Facebook page that you post a lot of the photos you've taken, as well as articles. Did you want to give your name out to the public?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, please come on my Facebook. It's just Craig, Craig, and last name Downer, Downer. Or if I were Italian, I'd say Dioner, as I sometimes do. And I'm getting some really good exchange of views from people all over, and I posted a lot of photos. I posted reports of mine and other items of interest. So yeah, feel free to come on that and let's join the conversations.
Because you put out information on petitions that we can sign. There's a lot of things.
Yeah, my petition is still active in collecting more signatures. The one I delivered back in late January and early February. It's Stop the Excessive Roundups.
Mm-hmm.
You can link that too on the wildhorseconspiracy.org, or just go on to Move On and type in my name and Stop the Excessive Roundups, and it'll come right up.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Craig. There's so much information, and we need people like you to counter the misinformation. Wild horses are our heritage, and we've got to protect them.
Well, thanks so much. I think they're so much a part of what makes America special, and we should have regard for these highly evolved creatures in their own right too. They're amazing.
And for anybody who has never read it, I really encourage Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, The Very Last Travel, where he's where the horses are the intelligent species and the humans are the yahoos. It's quite entertaining and somewhat self-enlightening. So
Yeah, that would seem to have been a bit prophetic, the way things are going these days.
yeah. Well, thank you very much, Craig. I encourage our listeners to look up his website, The Wild Horse Conspiracy. Get a hold of his book. It's a good read, very educational. And educate yourselves. We might learn something useful. And the most important part of learning is to unlearn what is untrue. So thank you very much, Craig.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark, and look forward to seeing you up there or down here. Anyone's also people want to come here, I'm glad to show them some of the herds. It's nothing I like more.
All right, great. We've been talking to Craig Downer, author of The Wild Horse Conspiracy. And this is Mark Matheson for Voices and Views. Have a good day.